Hi, and welcome to our recap. I'm just going to go through the entire Houdini scene just to cover everything that we've made, and then I'll take you through the final comp, which is, I'm calling it final so that we can move on to the next effect, basically, but there's still loads you can do in that comp. So, as we've seen, let me go here, and by the way, I was wrong about the geolight. So before, if you were pointing to geometry, even if you disabled the visual here and you switch the light off, Houdini would try and calculate that geometry, but now apparently that's all fixed. So I don't need to be writing null here and then remembering to remove it. So now if you just disable the light, it won't calculate, which is really good. So now I just force that geometry light in the mantra. So we had this scene and it just has a basic shader on it and the character as well, so nothing fancy there. And even our sky, what we've gone for is just the environment light as a background. So let's have a look at our main object here. It's taking a while. Here we go. So this was the main bulk of our effect, which I think is a pretty decently sized setup. It's not too big and it's pretty readable. So let's just go through quickly the thought process and the way I decided to make the setup the way I did. So as I mentioned at the beginning when we were looking at reference and the fact that compositionally I wanted the portal to feel quite dramatic, and for that reason to fill the entire top half of frame. So with that as well, I decided to not have a solid kind of portal. So what we could have done is have something more like this, in which the portal is forming a sort of solid film and the character would appear then through that. But I decided instead to go for something that tunnels into nothingness. So the character will fly through an open funnel. So for that reason, I desperately wanted something to fly outwards, and I thought it would help if there's a funnel into the room to have lots of particles flying from this point out. For compositional reasons as well, and also because for a portal it just makes sense. If someone's appearing in this environment, then they're coming from somewhere else. So if the particles were moving inward, it would feel like an entrance instead of an exit. So we just stuck to that. So I just, at the origin, put down a sphere, pretty much just set normals to velocity and shot some volume out in the stop. And so we just have a flattened sphere with velocities pointing outward. And I didn't even change any settings on that dot, pretty much. I just plugged it in. It's got basic turbulence and off it goes. And pretty much the entire setup from that point is based on that original simulation. So an interesting thing you could do is, if you had time, you could actually duplicate this whole node 3 or 4 times and just come up here and change the settings of this volume sim, and then set all these other ROPs to go after that, and you would end up with like a bunch of completely different looking portals. So it's completely procedural from that point of view, where if we can change something up here and everything will go down the pipe and update. So that worked out well. And then we simply took a circle that defines what we wanted the aperture of our portal to be, and ended up using that in a load of places, as you can see here. So once we scattered some points, I haven't really changed anything since you last saw it, I don't think. And you've seen we've used some pop fluids on one of these pop sims here, and the others are just basic normal advection with some pops or wrangles to manipulate the point clouds during the simulation. And I've saved all of those out, and then we came back and added a completely SOP based layer of just points and a noise, which I think actually made a very big difference in the comp in the end. Once we had all of those, they were completely formless, so they didn't look like a portal at all, and we just went and attribute transferred, changed colors, and manipulated that point cloud until it looked more like a portal, or more like we wanted the portal to look. So we did do a slightly different manipulation for each one of these, and we ended up with something pretty cool, I think. So we've got simulations that feel like they're warping in and out of space here, because they're being transferred, their position's being transferred to an animated circle there. And this one in particular was quite interesting. Just putting down a duplicate on that sim, and we got all this crazy stretching here, which I think worked really well. And then all of those once again ran through the same sort of network to warp the portal, bend it into the room, and let me just dive in. So in here there was just basically a bulge that I kind of thought worked. I put that down at first as a mistake and then decided to stick with it. Thought it could be useful to have the portal slightly leaning into the room. And then the magnet, which is pulling all of the points that are close to the center up, which actually ended up working quite well because of this layer here. So we have, especially from the camera, we're pulling some of those points up into that funnel. So that worked nicely. And then the attribute transfer is the opening. So we're just keying the attributes, the point position attribute being transferred from nothing into something. And as ever, as I said before, the attribute transfer, the only huge drawback there is it's slow. So when you're working with super large point clouds like that, it can get pretty difficult. So I actually ended up applying the same warping subnets to each one of these simulations. Then we just moved it into place. I had to remove some velocity attributes at some points to prevent super long render times, and then simply set our p-scale and our color multipliers. And down here it was just converting one of those particle layers into a VDB and then into geometry for our light. And that's pretty much it. I tried over here to make a light from just the portal shape, but it didn't look nearly as good as the light we made from the particle sim. And then over here is where I've taken the point cloud A and removed some points from it, applied the same transfer and transform, and output that, which is going to our next geometry, which was the embers. And in here, pretty basic, just removed most of these points. We set random p-scales and p-scale multipliers here based on a ramp to make sure we got some good variation in random values. You can see here I've actually gone for the 1/3 on this side, so I've got just a few small ones and then a lot of big ones. And here I'm just using a Voronoi on a grid that has a rest and a UV, so in the shader I can apply a noise based on the rest and use that as the texture. And I think these actually work pretty well as well, given that we didn't need to make a separate setup for these. Just basically copied on these flecks of geometry, and I thought it felt pretty good in the render. And then we did some very basic secondary elements for our environment. So what I really wanted was, when the portal comes on, to really feel like it sits in the environment in a way that the environment reacts. So as the portal opens, these little stones could roll around, some dust and particles can be kicked up. So we went to add those 3 layers, a pretty basic volume sim, actually using pretty much the same setup as the initial particle sims did. And I flattened it. So I did the exact same thing as the particles, and then some noise on the velocity. Just to see that there. And that was that. Inside the DOP, let's have a look what I went with for final velocities. So just the normal density, I've had 10 on the velocity, and I put down a gas turbulence based on density. So actually nothing going on there, but there is a negative buoyancy direction. So right now my sim is 0.025. So that looks okay. And that is running from frame 18 to 30. So one thing I did do, as we know from the first time, is I keyed a transform to make it feel even more explosive. So now it scales up really quickly, just to try and cover as much ground as possible there. And then I counter animated to get a stable velocity for the particles. Basic pyro shader for that as well. Particles was a basic advection, totally nothing going on there. And debris, pretty much the same thing as the flakes. I just plugged in I scattered some points and used the same setup as the flakes to make debris geometry. Random p-scale, everything the same, and then in the .NET I used the volume that does the dust to advect the bullet objects. So that was just set to force. And then some time shifts for all of those elements to kind of either make sure it only appears at a certain time or to make sure when it reaches a certain frame it stops. So in this case, these get kicked up and then they just stop. So we don't need any of that random bullet objects bouncing around thing. And that's it. We only have one extra light that our portal made. So that blue light from our portal. No other extra lights that come from the actual effect. And then just to save on time and potential re-renders, I've actually split this up into quite a lot of layers. Like I said before, magic does lend itself well to being split up because you can take it so much further in the comp. With magical stuff, you need to rely on a lot of comping at some point. So that's why I've gone for 4 layers of different particle sims, kept the flakes separate, and then for the dust particles and the dust volume itself and the environment and the character, that probably could have all been rendered in one. But just to save on my individual computer time and to make sure if I needed to change anything, I didn't have to re-render the whole shot again, I've split it into different layers. And I've pretty much been managing that just with forcing objects and forcing lights. And that's that. So I'll just end this recap here and I'll make a new one where we'll go over the comp. So I'll see you then.